And what I've tried to do with these three summits is really give you guys the opportunity to hear from both local and national experts, to be able to put your questions to them. In the first year I did this, we had Chris Stark, the CEO of the Independent Committee on Climate Change. The second year we had Alok Sharma. This year we've got Grant Shapps. I'm really pleased because he's got this new role, a new department with a really key role to play in the drive to net zero, and he'll be giving us the keynote in just a few minutes. But in general, you're not going to hear from me very much at this summit. My job is to welcome you all today, to chair, to take the questions. But I just want to say a couple of things before we kick off. The first is that we're meeting at quite an important point, obviously. Now, it's always an important point when it comes to protecting our environment and combating climate change, but it's particularly important at this time because there's a key debate going on about the trade-offs between when we have a cost of living crisis, when we have economic challenges. What do we do that enables us to keep making progress on this while making sure that those who are most vulnerable economically are not harmed by decisions that are taken? And you will all have seen that there's big debate going on this. There's some people pushing back against what the government has been doing in this area. I personally welcome that debate because when they try to suggest there's a trade-off between economic growth and what we're trying to do in reaching net zero, the facts are pretty clear that between 1990 and 2021, we saw emissions reduced in this country by 48%, while the economy grew by 65%. And through its net zero strategy, what the government's doing is mobilizing in the region of £100 billion into new technologies that will create in the region of 500,000 new green jobs, so that we don't see that sort of trade-off. But of course, at a time of cost of living, we have to be very mindful of the pressures that are on people's economic situations and do everything we can to make those as eased as possible. Now, there are lots and lots of things that I think the government has done very well. You will have views about what you think it should be doing better. But just last year, when you think about renewable energy, for example, we hit a record 24.6%, a quarter of our electricity generation coming from wind, which really does show what's possible. And not only have we cut emissions faster than any other developed economy, but we are always in the top countries in Europe or the world, top three for renewable energy in Europe, for example. That shows we are really pushing at the frontier here. I know there's more you would all like to see happen. And what I've been doing, as well as talking about this quite a lot in Parliament and on events in the constituency and holding events like this, is two important things. One, and those of you who've been at the first two climate summits will know this, continuing to push on the way we build houses, because we've had so many houses built in this constituency, which has put pressure on infrastructure, yes, but it's also put the wrong pressure on the environment, because the way in which they are built is making the situation worse. So we're pushing to ensure we have the highest standards there, and government's taken huge steps, particularly in the last 12 months, on raising the environmental standard of homes. You will know I've taken a lot of people down to Greencore's homes in Southmore, because there's such an impressive example there. And then the other thing is, as lead sponsor of the local electricity bill, where we've got to just under half of MPs now supporting that. And I've been working very closely with ministers in Grant's team to try and achieve what we want to with that bill, and to be able to enable a lot more renewable energy, because I know just in this constituency how popular that is with people, how much people would like to be able to generate their own energy, to be able to sell it to the local community. The startup cost, the barriers to this have been far too high. And so I'm very pleased that looks like we're going to make some real progress there, and watch this space, because I will be announcing that shortly. But Grant Shapps, as you can see on your screen, has now joined us. So I'm just going to say 2 housekeeping things at this point. Firstly, this is being recorded because each year I do this. I then put it on the website afterwards for people who are unable to be here so that they can watch it. So bear in mind that it is being recorded. And if you want to ask a question, please put the question in the Q&A. I won't be looking at the chat. You guys should use the chat all afternoon, but I won't be looking at any of that. So if there's a question you have, please put it in Q&A at the bottom rather than in chat. Otherwise, I won't hear it, but I won't see it. But look, thank you very much, Grant, for joining us. Grant is the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, a brand new department. He's really the key figure to help us try and get to net zero, but as well, you know, whilst making sure we are secure with our energy supply. Really grateful he's been able to make the time to be here. He will talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and then he will take your questions, as many as he can, in the time he has. So Grant, thank you very much. Over to you.
David, thanks very much. And just checking that you can hear me. Just want to see nod to that. I'm not hearing you, but that's probably because you just put yourself on mute. You definitely are hearing me, are you?
I had muted myself, so that's why you probably couldn't hear me. But yeah, if you could be a bit louder, it would help. Although
I'm not sure I have the ability to do that in the system here. So as long as you can reasonably hear me, I'll
crack on.
But first of all, I just wanted to congratulate you for doing this. I see above your head it says that it's the 3rd annual Wantage and Didcot Climate Summit, and I think it's brilliant that you're sort of keeping the flame alive and doing this every single year, net zero flame, I should say, alive and doing this every single year. It's really good, and I know that you've got a lot of constituents who are interested in this issue, so it's great to join you. And secondly, I was thinking about what I might just say in the opening words and trying to work out whether Didcot Power Station was in your patch, and suspect it must have been because of the name, and it stood there for over half a century, and it rather dominated, from what I recall, the rural South Oxfordshire skyline for all of those years. That was once voted Britain's 3rd most ugly eyesore in Country Life 2003. I noticed, and I don't suppose it was much more when it was blown up a few years ago as a result. But actually, there's really a lot more to do with energy links in your patch when I looked into it than just that power station. Just up the road, there's Cullen's Jet Laboratory, which I visited with the Prime Minister when I launched Powering Up Britain earlier in the year. And that's a place which is 10 times hotter than the centre of the sun. And it's a fusion experiment, essentially, laboratory. And if we can get this technology to work, then it could end all of our energy requirements in one go, and our net zero requirements. So there are big things that happen in your parts of the world, David. And obviously, one of the reasons why your constituents are so interested in the subject. I think actually, when I travel around the world, I find that everyone is saying to me, how did Britain get this extraordinary lead when it comes to net zero? I mean, we have the world's 4 largest offshore wind farms. We are the country that are most advanced in developing, fusion power in the really long term. We have cut our emissions by more than any other G7 country since 1990, whilst growing our economy 65%. We've had amongst the top 2 highest investments of any European nations into green energy, something like £200 billion since we came to power in 2010. And we're one of the only countries with a robust legal framework to get to net zero by 2050. So we've got all of these different things, that's just to name a few, plus many others. But in this country, and I've just come from oral questions in the House, as you know, where we were talking about energy security and net zero, you would think we were back of the pack. You would think that we were laggards. You would imagine that somehow Britain was letting the world down, whereas the truth is the other way round. But David, I don't mention that to diminish the size of the challenges to keep the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 alive. This is actually very, very difficult at a global scale. But that's precisely why the Prime Minister set up this new department earlier this year for energy security and net zero. It recognises the threats to us from Putin's invasion, but also that we do still need to, the flip side of the same coin, get to net zero future. And that's why we've been structured. And again, actually, when I look around the world and I meet with my opposite numbers, very few countries have actually set this up in such a sort of clean and obvious way, having an energy security and net zero minister in the same role, which I see as being two sides of the same coin. The other big solution to our problems of getting to net zero, other than renewables, for which we've been doing incredibly well, as I say, first quarter of this year, 43% of our electricity has come from renewables, over 40% last year. The number of offshore wind farms, for example, going up by a record amount last year. But the other part of this is nuclear. We've got Hinkley Point C, we've got Sizewell C, big new nuclear installations. And then we're going to back that up by having small modular reactors, and that's a big part of the program. I'm launching next week Great British Nuclear, which will be all about how we get from where we are today, about 16% of our energy coming from nuclear, to get about a quarter of it, to give us that base load in the future by using some of the new technologies, including small modular reactors as well. So really exciting things, but I often sort of say the best energy of all is the energy that we never use, the energy that we never have to switch on. And so energy efficiency is a very big, important part of our plan as well. And we set up a task force with the aim of reducing by 15% our energy consumption, which is an important part of the kind of overall plan. So what I'd sort of, the way I pitch this is that this government's got the answers to these very big, complex problems. We're world leaders in many of the different fields. I don't believe the answers are sort of people who go around at the fringes of society, gluing themselves to motorways, interrupting test matches, trying to get into Wimbledon. This isn't the way to make change happen. And you think if you listen to them that we were laggards, as I say, we're actually leaders. And so it's really a lot of other countries where the pressure needs to be piled in. Just one final thing. I believe that it is important that we both protect our energy security as well as reducing our carbon. My legal duty is to reduce carbon. So I'm totally committed to that. But to get there, we don't do it by relying more and more and more on foreign nations, by basically putting our eggs in the basket of people like Putin, who can then essentially threaten us with that energy security. Which is why, as we step down in our carbon, we will still need to have more oil and gas licenses. Even if I signed off every single oil and gas license that would ever come across my desk, we'd still have a reduction of about 7% a year from North Sea oil and gas. But since the only other option is to import that oil and gas from abroad, because we can't switch off our gas heating, we can't switch off all of the cars instantaneously that are using petrol. That means that we'd not only be at the behest of other countries, and some of them are not all that friendly or reliable, but we'd also be importing those hydrocarbons, the oil and gas, at something like twice the amount of embedded carbon in the process. It made no sense at all. That is the opposition's policy. I think it's insane. It puts us all at risk of great energy insecurity whilst not actually sorting out the problem. So, I think there is a pathway here, which I know we're going to discuss, not least in the question that's just flashed up there, that we should discuss and we should debate. I'm confident we can reach it, and I'm going to explain why. But let's do that in questions. I'm going to stop there and hand back to you.
Right, thank you very much. Very good scene setting. And yes, the questions have been flowing in. So I will do these largely in the order that they've come in, but not having too many from the same person. The first question was about the Climate Change Committee, saying that we're not on track to meet our 5-year budget for carbon. So what is being done to make us lead on this new industrial revolution as we once did, is the question.
So one of the problems with these things is that the media will interpret what they think they've been told and always go for the most extreme interpretation. That's how news gets sold, right? And so actually, what the Committee for Climate Change actually wrote in their report is we've not only met the first and second carbon budgets, we've exceeded the first and second, we'll exceed the third, and this year they are more confident about our meeting our fourth carbon budget than they were last year when they reported. It is true to say that they then said they are concerned about the prospects for carbon budget 5 and carbon budget 6. Carbon budget 6, by the way, runs till 2037, right? So these are still significant distance out. I think it's also true to say, if you look back in history at what people were saying before carbon budget 1, 2, 3, and 4, they were saying exactly the same types of things that the Committee for Climate Change is saying, said last week about the future. In other words, quite rightly, holding our feet to the fire and saying, we have significant concerns. This is where you would need to raise your game. Doing exactly the job we set the committee up to do. It's our committee. We set them up. We said, no holds barred. Tell us what you really think, and they do, and we shouldn't be surprised about that. But what I'd say to those who, I think Michael asked that question a moment ago, what I'd say is, judge me not by what I say I'm going to do, judge us by our record. And our record's not just met these carbon budgets, we've exceeded them every single time. And in the nearer term, that's carbon budget 4, which, off the top of my head, I think runs to 2033, if I'm right. They're now more, sorry, that's carbon budget 5. But in any case, the on carbon budget 5, which runs to 2033, they're more confident of us meeting it than they were previously. So they're right to, of course, pull out all of the reasons for concern. The media will go for the most extreme interpretation of that, but the overall picture is one which I say the world actually looks for us at our leadership on this, and I'm not giving that up anytime soon.
Great. Next question was from Douglas, which was National Grid have announced they're going to spend 200 billion upgrading the grid by 2035. Who is going to pay for that?
Yeah, I'm afraid the bad news is ultimately we end up paying as either as taxpayers or as energy consumers. The good news is it will ultimately make our energy cheaper. And one of the things that I pledged since coming and creating this department is to get us to amongst the cheapest wholesale electricity prices in Europe by the middle of the next decade, exactly the time scale the Ofgem plan relates to. If I look at energy prices in Europe at the moment, because for a whole bunch of structural reasons, we pay amongst the highest energy prices, I think possibly the second highest wholesale prices in Europe. I don't want that to continue to be the case. It's not quite as black and white as that figure sounded. For example, we pay about 40–45% less for our gas and electricity than the Germans do at a domestic level. It's just that their industry pays less still. So it's not entirely black and white. But what is my goal, which is to get consumers paying less here and to get us much closer to and below the European average. So that investment that we're talking about, that Ofgem are talking about, yes, of course, I'm not going to sort of pull the wool over anyone's eyes, but eventually consumers will pay, either through taxes or through the energy that we all use. But the good news is that as we decarbonise the network and as we become more capable of powering Britain from Britain, we get greater energy security, and I expect to see our prices first start to rival and then better prices compared with our European neighbours, which would be a very good thing for business and obviously for households.
Thank you. Just a reminder, because I can see some people are putting questions in the chat. I won't see questions in the chat, so only put them in the Q&A. The next question was from Emma, who works for STFC, and she wants to know whether you're aware of the cutting-edge technologies in the Oxfordshire region, such as Jet Zero, and she'd like to know what you think is the biggest challenge in achieving net zero at the moment.
So by jet zero, I'm not sure if that question refers to work on aviation.
I think it does.
This is it's a phrase I actually coined, jet zero, and the idea of jet zero and guilt-free flying was the basis upon which I set up for the government something called the Jet Zero Council, which is bringing academics and industry and government together. And we're working on some of the world's most important science related to getting to jet zero travel, hence the name Jet Zero Council. And you're very aware, I'm a pilot, so I'm fascinated by this area. I recognise the importance. Aviation won't be able to continue unless it solves the problem of decarbonising. So I've been very closely involved in a lot of the initiatives and funding of some of the best companies and scientists in this sphere. So yeah, really strongly aware of the work from sustainable aviation fuel to actually not far away where I went in Vista a couple of weeks ago to have a look at Zero Petroleum, a company who are producing fuel from air and water effectively, and they can turn that into any type of fuel, aviation or car fuel, through to the potential for hydrogen in aviation and also batteries. And so I think I probably know virtually every firm involved in this, including setting up a competition, which was to get the world's first transatlantic aircraft flying at jet zero. Virgin won the right to do it, and they're working on the detail of their plan right now.
Do you just want to say something briefly on the last part of her question, which was what you think is the biggest challenge in achieving net zero at the moment?
So actually, interestingly, just stepping back from aviation, in all other areas, we sort of have the solutions broadly in view. So with road transport, cars and vans in particular, it's perfectly possible to drive electric. I drive an electric car. I've done for years. I'd never go back. They're brilliant. That's fine. On things like energy production, this country's shown how we've gone from back in 2010, before the Cameron government, only about less than 7% of our energy was renewable, from the renewable sources. Just as I just mentioned, 43% of it in the last quarter is renewable. So we know how to crack those problems, and the mixture of nuclear in there will help with that. But actually, things like aviation are probably right at the sort of cutting edge of what's required. Quite hard to get an aircraft to fly with batteries. They're very heavy, and the engine is not as dense. So you've got to think about using things like sustainable aviation fuel and synthetic aviation fuel for quite some time to come, whilst inventing the other technologies. So I think those are the real challenges. And as the CCC, Committee for Climate Change, point out, there are many challenges along the way. I guess I'm just on the sort of more optimistic side, looking at what we've done so far, which is to exceed everybody's expectations. I cannot see any reason with British entrepreneurship and science, we shouldn't be able to both reach and smash these targets going forward as well.
And interestingly, on the synthetic fuel point, we have Williams Racing in the constituency, and F1 is going great guns in developing synthetic fuel at the moment. You may or may not know. Right, so we've got a range of opinions on here. So here's a question from a completely different angle from Andrew. Why is the Conservative government pursuing net zero? It's a deeply unconservative policy, a prescription for government interference in all aspects of our lives, and allows environmental groups to thwart infrastructure delivery through never-ending legal challenges.
Yeah, look, I just fundamentally don't agree. Actually, interesting, I was just discussing this point with in the tea room in the House of Commons, actually with John Redwood, who is sort of no wet on these subjects. But actually, he and I agree. First of all, the clue is in the name, Conservative to conserve, and is actually part of the title of Conservatives, and I think we should leave the planet in a better state than we find it. But more important than that, actually, if it's it's good for us from a health point of view, and it is going to leave the planet better for our children. And why not do it? And actually, this is what I was just discussing with John Rebel, and we both agree. You don't get here, and this is where I probably agree with your contributor. You don't get there by ramming it down people's throats. I mean, the official opposition approach is literally to switch off oil and gas licenses, stop granting them, buy our energy from abroad, make ourselves, at the whims of Putin or the next dictator. I don't agree with any of that. You've got to make it so it's a sort of pain-free approach. So it's just a nicer approach. Driving an electric car is a very pleasant approach. They're powerful. They're more powerful typically. They are comfortable. They tend to be more modern because they're new cars. You can, if you have space, a driveway, which 70% of people do, you can charge them at home. If you don't, that's where the government money is going to build the on-street network, which you can't do with your petrol car. You can't leave your house every day and have 100% fuel. So there's nothing incompatible with this. Saving the planet, reserving it or conserving it for future generations, and wanting people to live better lives. I don't believe people should be told to go and live in caves for the good of, for the good of humankind, and stop eating meat and all this sort of, stop flying around the world and all this sort of nonsense. I believe the opposite to all of that, and I think we can have the best of both worlds.
Great. Very short and sweet question from Rodney. What's the timescale for our nuclear power?
So right now we have about, as I mentioned, 16% of our power is nuclear. The power station, the new nuclear power station at Hinkley is very well developed. It's vast. I went to see it. It covers 250 football pitches in size. The output in terms of electricity will be the world's most powerful nuclear power station. And it's extraordinary. And then we're building a second one, which we've not yet started, but planning is being done for, which is at Sizewell C. So those two, one of them is very well progressed. I think 27, something like that, for it to come online, maybe 28. The other one is behind, but will follow the exact same pattern. Then when it comes to small modular reactors, this is technology which is still undeveloped. The only company in this country who've got through any of the regulatory phases is Rolls-Royce. So they're the most developed. And Great British Nuclear, which is the delivery government body that we're setting out to make sure we can do this, are going to set out timeframes for every part of this. The actual approval, or what we call the down selection, which technologies for small modular reactors that we're undertaking, is the fastest of any in the world. So we are. We'll have an answer to that later this year, beginning of next year, on the technologies that we'll actually be using.
Okay. I have my view on this, I'm sure you will too, but Kat says government continues to ignore renewable solutions that would work this year and instead focuses on nuclear and fusion and hydrogen, which will take decades to come on stream and will be far too late to keep 1.5 alive.
Yeah, look, with huge respect, it's just not true. As I pointed out, if you went back to rewind the clock to 2010, when the original version of this government came in, renewables were 6.9%. 6.9. They're now 43% of the grid. That is not sitting on waiting. Another stat: this last year we switched on the biggest ever expansion in offshore wind, the biggest ever for us. We don't just have the world's largest offshore wind farm, we've got the world's second largest, the third largest, the fourth largest, and they're all in the North Sea. They're all off the United Kingdom. Kind of goes to my point at the beginning, David, that people don't think we're doing well in this country. In fact, you have to go abroad to understand that we are actually the global leaders in many of these different areas. And I think your constituent is correct that there are things which are long-term plays. Hydrogen's not really that far away, by the way, but yes, of course, things like fusion. It's a joke in physicists, it's always 20 years away, doesn't matter when you ask. There are other things which I haven't mentioned, like space-based solar, which could, by 2050, perhaps provide 3/4 of our energy for our homes, electricity for our homes. There are new technologies which are further away, but we are getting on with the other stuff right now. And no other country, no other G7 country can match where we are. We have, amazingly, looking out my window here today, it's pretty overcast in London here. We have as much solar power as France, despite being half the size and despite clearly not having quite as nice weather as they do. We are really good at this stuff, and we're certainly not sitting around.
Okay. I'm going to take these two together because although they're not directly related, they're essentially the same sort of question. So a couple of people have asked about onshore wind. You know, are we committed to it? What are the restrictions? And then Val has asked what our policy is on home insulation. So essentially two policy, you know, what's our policy on onshore wind? What's our policy on home insulation?
Sure. So look, on onshore wind, I constantly hear people saying we've banned onshore wind. Again, first of all, facts first. It's amongst our greatest single resource for renewables. In fact, I think onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar all vie for which is number one. But there's already quite a lot of it. Secondly, I think it's the case, and everybody agrees now, I think it is, so it should be for local people to decide. So we'll make sure that policy shifts us in that direction, and where it's popular and wanted, and I know there are communities who want that, I think we should do it. On the other hand, I don't think that every single community should necessarily have to establish wind farms. So I think they should go where they're wanted, and I think we are able to move policy to deliver exactly that. On home insulation, another interesting stat, because we're all used to thinking, and indeed I often say, we have some of the oldest housing in Europe. The Victorians were brilliant on many things, but insulated homes wasn't one of them. And our housing stock doesn't therefore lend itself to being kind of airtight. But good news on this front, when we came to power, about 14% of our housing was sufficiently insulated, measured A to C on an energy performance certificate. Today, that figure is 47%. This year, it will be 50%. So we've got to the point where half of our housing, and it's difficult housing stock, but half of it is well insulated. We want to go a lot further, and we're partway through a plan which is £12.2 billion, maybe £12.5 billion now and into the next spending review period to help insulate yet more homes.
And then I know you've only got a minute or so left, so I'm just going to put these two together as well, because they're right up your street from your previous job. So the first is Germany has brought in the €49 per month unlimited public transport ticket. Currently, this is from Stuart. Currently in the UK, it's far, far cheaper to drive or even fly than take the train. So when will the government consider a similar ticket to that of Germany to encourage public transport use? And then right at the same time, Malcolm said, why are we building railways like East West Rail that are not initially electrified? So two from your transport brief there.
Okay, so first of all, we're all very good at quoting Germany. So here's a quote for Germany. They just closed down last month their last remaining nuclear power station. There's nothing wrong with it. They just decided they don't want to do it. And they are opening up coal stations. So unfortunately, their economy, including their transport network, is just in the context of this discussion on climate, is moving in the wrong direction, which is, I think, a great shame. By contrast, we have one available coal power station left, and it's very, very, very infrequently switched on. I think about 0.2% of our energy this year so far has been from coal, electricity from coal. But that's not really the question. The question is on ticket pricing. And look, I agree. I want ticket pricing to be cheaper on public transport. To get there, we need to have more efficient trains. Our train sector, our drivers and whatever, are the best paid in Europe by some way. Our practices date back to, in some cases, the 50s, 60s, in one case back to the 20s. And so to get our railway efficient and being able to bring down prices, we need to be prepared to make some of these difficult decisions about ticket offices, which people aren't using very much anymore, but we still keep them open. About the hours, the 4-day working weeks and all those sort of things, in order to be able to offer better ticket prices. Where I could, whilst I was Transport Secretary, I tried to sort of make it easier. For example, there's a £2 bus fare that I introduced last summer. Actually, initially as a temporary 3-month programme. It's been so popular, it's been extended and re-extended. It's just been re-extended again the £2 bus fares do make it a lot for people to get around. I think it's very desirable. And East West Rail, yes, I really would like that to be planned as being zero carbon from the outset. I think actually it turned out that the technology wasn't quite ready to deliver what was required for the specifications of that railway line, but nor was putting in overhead cables and going electric, which would be the traditional way of getting to a zero carbon line. And what is reckoned is that we can have some very, very efficient trains, much less carbon coming out of them from a modern rolling stock, and then switch that out to a zero carbon train and do that without spending the money on the overhead lines. That was basically the calculation that was made. Now you might just think, well, stuff it, just spend the money on the overhead lines and go straight for it. To which I would say, that's absolutely fine. Which other project do you not want to build? Because we've just spent all the money doing that. So as ever in government, the governors to choose, we had to make some difficult decisions about the best way to go forward, and that's the one we chose.
Perfect. Grant, thank you so much. I know we're a couple of minutes over time. The questions flooded in, so I couldn't get to everybody's, but we've got quite a few, and most of those who'd only asked once. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to picking up the conversation with you again. But I can tell from the engagement, people found that very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And you keep up the great work as well.
Thanks, Grant.
Cheers.
Right, everybody. So we're now going to move into a session about energy sources of the future. Because, look, I essentially wanted to have 3 sessions today, and it proved to be a difficult day for getting all the speakers that I wanted. I would have had one on nature as well, but we're going to have one on energy. We're going to have one on water, and we've got 3 really great speakers coming for the energy session. Professor Adrian Ball, Mike Blanche, and Jack Richardson, who will join in about 10 minutes, which was the quickest that he could be here. So Professor Adrian Ball is the chair in nuclear energy and society at the University of Manchester. So he's going to focus very much on nuclear, which is his expertise. Mike Blanche, some of you will know, he was at one of my previous summits, very involved in Westmill and wind energy. And then when Jack arrives, he's head of energy and climate at Onward, the think tank, and he's going to focus on hydrogen, which is what we expected him to talk about, and asked him to talk about rather. And so I can see from a lot of the questions that you were asking Grant about nuclear and wind and hydrogen and so on, that this should be a well-timed session for you. So I think we will start with Mike, who's Associate Director at BVG Associates. I saw him join very early on here. I've asked each person to speak for about 10 minutes, and that will allow good sort of half an hour discussion then with you guys and with each other. So Mike, if you're there, which I think you are, because I saw you join quite early on. Let's try and find you. There you are. Just going to get you to rejoin as a panelist because you're currently in as a guest. There you are.
Hello.
Hello. There we are. It worked. It worked.
It obviously functions.
So, Mike, thanks very much for being here again. I think you've got some slides.
I've got a few slides. Yes.
Yeah,
how long should I talk?
Screen.
Yeah. How long should I talk for?
About 10 minutes, if you can, and
yeah.
then we'll get Adrian and Jack in, and then anything you don't cover, we can do in the discussion.
Great. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that'll work.
So again, just a reminder, questions in the Q&A for this session, and if you particularly want to ask specifically Mike or specifically Jack or specifically Adrian, then say so. Otherwise, I will just put them to the panel and see who wants to answer what. But Mike, thanks very much, and over to
Great.
you.
Well, thank you, David. And it was good to invite you the other day to, well, a while ago, to come and visit Westmill Wind Farm and Solar Park. And we know that Ed Vasey, your predecessor, opened the solar park, so we were delighted by that. Hopefully you can see can you see a slide that says wind update Didcot Wantage Climate Summit?
Yes, we can.
You see?
Yes, we
Good.
can.
That's brilliant. So happy, David, for you to circulate these slides after. That was just a little bit about me. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and I have been working in the field for 30 odd years, and started in onshore wind with very small things. I used to run the test site at Rutherford Appleton Laboratory many years ago, and since advised many governments around the world on wind policies and things of that nature. So I was just going to do a quick update on where the UK wind status is. We have some really rather challenging targets, which is good for offshore wind, 50 gigawatts by the end of 2030, 5 gigawatts is floating. We're not going to meet either of those, but it's great to have those challenges. The industry actually went into the government, it had its first round table with the government ever, actually, last year. It asked for the onshore wind target to go up, but it got the offshore one raised instead by 10 gigawatts, so it was not quite expecting that. But the thing with wind is the technology continues to improve, and the underlying costs, and I say underlying costs because we know that there's been various price inflation, but the underlying costs of energy continue to reduce, although commodity price inflation recently, and inflation generally, has raised prices by about 20%, but that's across the board of everything. Offshore turbines now up to sort of ratings of 15 megawatts, 250 meters in diameter, huge things really. Maybe there's one that's been installed up 16 megawatt up to 270 meters in diameter, and that's just driving the price down, continues to do it. Onshore also up to 6 megawatts. The ones at Westmill are tiny, they're only 1.3 megawatts, just to give you an idea about how big they are. And you're talking about things like 163 meters in diameter turbines, tip height 195, so really big chunky things. So if you were going to redo Westmill now, it would probably be just one large wind turbine that, albeit would be taller, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it further away, and it would turn slower because the tip speeds of turbines are all about the same. Scotland, where it's easier to get planning permission because it's a more straightforward system, is systematically now going through old planning permissions, saying, you know, are you actually going to build this? It's also going through grid connection, systematically going through that to weed out things that are blocking new projects. So that's good to see. But the argument for onshore wind, and that may have been something that was behind some people's questions earlier to Grant, was that we can actually develop onshore capacity far quicker, particularly in England, Wales, where there's less grid constraint at the moment than, say, Scotland. And also the real grid constraint with Scotland is being able to feed south, where you know, England has a much higher power demand, as you might appreciate, given population size and industry and things of that nature. So we can do it 3 times quicker, and that's probably the underlying argument about why we think onshore capacity, or the industry thinks onshore capacity, is something we'd like to see back in, and we'd ideally like, maybe I'll say that. Yeah, we'd ideally like the ministerial statement that was made just removed, but I think Grant was hinting at that that wouldn't be the case, and I think that becomes difficult because I think confidence is eroded. You have to spend quite a bit of money developing wind farms for all the right reasons to meet best practice, and I think that may just, you know, people do have a choice. They have a choice about whether to develop something in Germany or in Britain. So there's a choice there. Yeah, there's also a coming, some people describe it as a cliff, but there is this case where the RO ceases in a lot of onshore renewables in 2027. And the thought is, you know, what we want a clear government steer on what to do. Can we repower sites, enhance them, which is is basically fitting larger rotors to existing turbines, things like that, or life extend them. Those are clearly important things. And also we have the CFD, which seems to work very well but it's the sole government mechanism really for price support. And when I say price support, it's more about, well, we've seen various people who have CFDs try not to take them because they can sell more at wholesale. It's been a crazy year really for electricity prices and things like that. But there is allocation 5 underway, which is great, and they happen every year now, which is super. So there's a real pathway to how things do get perhaps long-term certainty. It's probably the thing to say rather than price support. But it would be nice to have something, a separate mechanism, again, for projects that are of a reasonable size, 10 megawatts, say, up to 20 megawatts, but something like that, which more could be 3 turbines in a field, that type of scale of things. It would be nice to have something like that, because that could happen quite quickly. And also, as an industry, we're looking to make sure we've got community benefits firmly bolted on to certainly onto onshore wind, and trying to do it with offshore wind as well. And that includes ownership. So you may be aware that Westmore Wind Farm, for example, is 100% community owned. We've seen some really very funny things happen in offshore development, because offshore developers are now starting to say, having had a massive market, and Grant is right in terms of having the 4 largest wind farms in the world, we'd be really happy to world leader, and a great credit to the government for supporting offshore wind, and we've seen a great price reduction in it, and we still expect to see more price reduction at the underlying price, as I mentioned. But they're starting now to say, oh, there are APAC projects that we could do. So, and they might be more make more money from that. They always moan that they don't make enough money. So there are some dynamics changing in the market, and we're also seeing oil and gas majors coming majorly to the market, and they're doing some strange things. They're increasing the prices of leases, so the Crown Estate is delighted by that. It gets a lot of money from those lease payments, but they seem to be beyond what you might expect from normal levelized cost of energy. And so there are other things like share price that need to get into markets where oil and gas now are getting real problems getting money from banks, which is a great thing actually, if they're not reducing emissions, decarbonising. And so the industry's view on non-price mechanisms, which happen elsewhere, you don't just merely have an auction for the CFD based on price, but there are other factors, such as local content, for example, can be one of those factors. I'm an expert in that, but seems to be much more support for a non-price mechanism just for stabilizing the market, rather than just merely about local content. So stabilizing the price. So but that's something certainly that we've seen in recent months. Grant mentioned power quite a bit, and I just thought it might be interesting just to look at what the electricity system operator came up with their scenarios going forward. And this is for offshore wind, but the simple thing is that basically our electricity demand will increase by about 3 times from now until 2050. So just considering that, we go from something like 14 or 15 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity today, probably up to well over 100. We've done scenarios for the Crown Estate which go up much higher than that, because, surprise it or not, Germany can't decarbonize itself. It doesn't have enough sources of energy. It would need to get exports from us. So there's this great thing about export market for the UK, which is a super thing. But I just wanted to make it clear how much expansion in just alone in offshore wind we're going to see, and offshore wind in 2050 becomes responsible for over half our energy, and that's what decarbonisation means. All of these scenarios here, I haven't explained them, but there are different scenarios that I use: customer transformation and system transformation. System transformation has a much more hydrogen in it, but I understand that we'll talk about that later. But there's different routes to getting to net, but they're all getting to net zero. The only one that falls short is the one that's the grey dashed line, but it's still significant growth, even in that scenario. I was going to say, and I rather like this. This is quite an old curve, but it was something that there are other ways to reducing energy, and one of the ways that happened in Belgium was that a local DNO, like SSEN in our constituency, was actually made a co-op. So it had greater community control and democracy, and you can see it sort of slashed its demand. I think this is per household demand. They went from fossil fuels, nuclear fuels, to renewable energy, and they slashed their waste, and they went from a centralized to a much more decentralized production. So Grant was talking about 15% reduction in energy efficiency. This is achieved more. So there are other options of how that can be done. And this wind farm is one of the oldest wind farms in the world. Ørsted, one of the main developers of offshore wind, owns 10 of the turbines, and Middle Grumman Cooperative owns 10 as well. So we've seen that that can happen even on larger scale projects, and like to see more of that. Yeah, and I'm just on a personal sort of appeal about investing in the future. There are various co-ops that can be invested in. Energy for All has co-ops. The local low carbon hub based in Oxfordshire has a community energy fund, so they have people investing in that. And I just wanted to ask you just to think about your pension and your bank. What are they doing with the money? I mentioned earlier that banks have now got much more critical on what they're investing in terms of decarbonisation, which is great to see on one level and a good challenge to everybody. But that's something that's happening quite as we speak. The other thing was just to say on hydrogen, there's a cautiousness on hydrogen. We also were asked to comment, BBG Associates, to the Crown Estate on what they should be thinking about hydrogen production. And actually, I'll just go back to this graph, because quite a bit of the system transformation did include having a fair chunk of hydrogen production. So it's in the future thinking of most people, but the challenge is to use it for what it's needed for. Grant himself said there's no real point having cars that don't run on electricity. There's a pecking order, and the trouble with producing hydrogen is it's an extra step. It's less efficient than going to electricity straight away. And one of the classic things here is heat pumps. You know, electric heat pumps, for example, use far less energy than hydrogen boilers, and it's probably about 9 times, maybe it's 8, maybe it's 7, but it's certainly a multiplier like that, because a heat pump is effectively pumping heat, whereas hydrogen, you're getting a conversion that's not turning everything into heat. In fact, it's quite a poor conversion, and so it's considerably worse. So there are some things we think, I think that going forward, one would like to avoid doing. I just want to say briefly about WeSet. We are a local charity based around the Westmill Wind Farm, but we have learning resources on our website, so please use that. If you want to visit the solar park and wind farm, please do that as well. There are days that are scheduled, so that can happen. And that was me. So back to you, David. Any particular questions? Happy to field anything, really.
Great. Well, Mike, thanks very much. Great as ever. And we'll save we have been having some questions come in for you, but we're going to save those, let each person do their talk, and then we'll put the questions to you all together and hopefully have a good discussion. So next, I'd like to bring on Professor Adrian Bull, Chair in Nuclear Energy and Society at the University of Manchester. So very grateful to Adrian being here. He's got 40 years experience in the nuclear sector. This is obviously a very hot topic at the moment. It's had I suppose a controversial history for some people who don't think we should be doing it. The government's got very much behind it now. So looking forward to hearing what Adrian has to say. Again, Adrian, if you can talk for sort of 10 or so minutes, then we'll bring Jack in on hydrogen, and then we'll get to everybody's questions and have a discussion. But welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to be part of the session today. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my title slide.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. That's probably the most technically challenging thing I will be doing this week, is making sure that happens. So I'm just going to say a little bit about me. I'm an engineer by background, 40 odd years ago. I've had, as you said, 40 years working in the UK nuclear sector, but the last half of my career has been around policy, communications, and particularly stakeholder engagement. I worked with British Nuclear Fuels Limited, then Westinghouse, and latterly for 10 years as External Relations Director of the UK's National Nuclear Lab. And then I joined the Dalton Nuclear Institute, which is part of the University of Manchester, a couple of years ago now, where I'm a part-time academic, and my main focus there is on how the nuclear world, nuclear industry, engages with the much wider world outside, which it hasn't always done very well, as we can probably agree, which may be the root of some of its problems and challenges that it faces today. I'm going to, if I can, how do I move my slide on? Oh, there we go. Two at once, beg your pardon. I'm going to try and answer 6 very quick questions about nuclear in my slides, starting with the what, then a bit about the why, where, who, how, and when, and you can probably guess the answer to when. But starting off with what, and the first part of what is what is nuclear. Nuclear reactors are really very similar to coal and gas plants. They use heat to make steam, and that drives a turbine and makes the electricity that comes into our homes and industry and so on. But in nuclear, that heat comes from splitting atoms, particularly uranium atoms. So uranium atoms can be split in 2. That generates an awful lot of energy. The fuel in the reactor gets very hot, and it also creates new atoms, which are made from splitting the uranium atom in half. And there's a question already around nuclear waste. We may well come back to this in some of the discussion, but some of those new smaller atoms that are formed by the heat production process are themselves highly radioactive, so they need to be handled very carefully, whether that's as used fuel or as nuclear waste. So the next part of the what, not what is it, but what have we got? Well, the world, Britain, as Grant Shapps mentioned, Britain's leading the world in net zero. Britain also led the world in nuclear energy, going back nearly 70 years now. Her Majesty the Queen opened the world's first commercial nuclear station in Calder Hall in Cumbria. We had a lot of nuclear stations. We've now only 5 that are still operating. 2 of those are at Heysham in Lancashire, 1 in Hartlepool, 1 at Torness in Scotland, and Sizewell B in Suffolk. And all of those, except Sizewell B, are due to close by 2028, which is not very far away. We've already seen 14 UK nuclear power stations close down because they've reached the end of their commercially viable life. And also, as Grant Shapps mentioned, we're building 1 more at the moment, Hinkley Point C, which is due online sometime towards the back end of this decade. And we're all very keen to see, or in the nuclear world, we're keen to see that happen. Sizewell C, which will be a replica of Hinkley Point C, is in the planning stage at the moment and in the confirmation of funding. And that is also planned. Government will take a stake in that, along with EDF, who are developing Sizewell and other majority owners of Hinkley Point C. Moving on to the why, and I'm probably not telling people anything you don't know already, but nuclear is low carbon. A lot of today is focused on low carbon and reducing carbon emissions. Nuclear is among the lowest carbon dioxide producers per unit of electricity. It's on a par with the renewables. And it's the only large-scale baseload low-carbon source. And by baseload, I mean power that can be generated reliably 24/7 every day of the year. And that brings me on to one of the next attributes of nuclear. It produces secure, reliable supplies of electricity in very large quantities. It's not weather dependent. It operates round the clock every day of the year when it's running. And typically, it's only shut down for a scheduled refueling and maintenance period. A couple of weeks at a time. And it's resilient to disruption in fuel supply. So if we did have issues around bringing uranium into this country for whatever reason, the nuclear stations, there's a buffer of material that's already being used to make new fuel. And even if new fuel didn't get to the reactors when it was due to, they wouldn't simply stop generating. It's just that the power output from those stations would gradually decrease over weeks and months. So nuclear is very resilient to the unexpected. One of the historic barriers has always been the cost building nuclear stations. They are notoriously expensive to build, very high capital cost, but once they are built, they run predictably, stably for many decades, typically 60 years design lifetime. And their running costs are relatively low and stable and predictable. And that means we can have some confidence in what our energy bills are going to be like out into the future. Where have we had nuclear and where might we have future nuclear? The big stations of the kind that we built in the past have almost all been built on the coast. They needed seawater for cooling, to provide the heat sink for a lot of the waste heat that those gigawatt scale reactors would produce, 1,000 megawatts typically from an individual power station. We had one exception, Trosvynid, which was built on an inland lake in Snowdonia in North Wales. That's a relatively small reactor, and it was one of the early ones we built. And you can see from the map there, the red dots are those 5 active reactors, 2 of them at Heysham, which is why there's only 1 dot there, 4 dots in total. Those yellow dots show the coastal sites for the reactors that are currently being decommissioned. But as we move forward, we may not be building just those large stations anymore. Secretary of State mentioned small modular reactors, SMRs, newer, smaller reactors that have the potential to be built in land. They're much more flexible in terms of where they can be sited. They can also be built quicker than the larger power stations that we've had before. They don't need that seawater, so potentially they could go inland. They could go on existing non-nuclear power station sites. They could go on perhaps existing nuclear sites that haven't been power stations. Or they could be close to some of the big intensive users of electricity and also heat. Those reactors can produce an awful lot of heat, and instead of just discharging that to the sea, we could be looking to use that in industry rather than relying on other sources of energy to provide the heat that industry and potentially even homes need in the future. Some of the who, well, who's going to make this happen? And the answer to that is it has to be a partnership between government and the utilities operators and investors. There's a role for government. Government will have an impact on the siting policy, on the regulation, and on the financing. We've seen with both Hinkley C, with Sizewell C, and some of those other nuclear projects that haven't come to fruition, government has had to be involved in defining what is the funding model and the revenue model for the developers to make those stations happen. And government also, I think, needs to recognise the impact on the national goals that nuclear seeks to help support, whether that's energy security, whether it's net zero, whether it's levelling up our economy, the fact that nuclear is typically built and much of the nuclear workforce is in some parts of the country that don't have an awful lot of other industry, the skills issue and providing the skill base for nuclear, and government's role in not just shaping energy prices, but reacting and responding to what we expect energy prices to be in the future in a wider economic sense, because we've all seen the impact that energy prices have on everything that we spend money on. So government really needs to be involved from a funding point of view as well, to help provide sufficient demonstration of the viability of new nuclear to encourage private sector investment to step in as well. But as I said, there's also a role for utilities operators and private investors to finance technology once it is proven and demonstrated, and once those risks are manageable compared with the size of those operations. And I think it's important to recognise EDF, backed by the French government, still couldn't fund Hinkley Point C, or chose not to fund Hinkley Point C on their own. They needed investment from the Chinese to support that. With Sizewell C, we've seen our own government coming in alongside EDF to provide funding and support there. So those large stations are huge and need a government role as well as and alongside private sector investment. How do we want to see it happen? Well, really importantly, in my view, this is not a battle between nuclear and renewables or any other route to low carbon. We need them all. It's such a challenge. We need every tool in that toolbox. So we need nuclear as well as vast amounts of renewables, lots of energy efficiency, hydrogen, which I know we're going to talk about, electric vehicles, and much more responsible use of energy as a nation. But we at the Dalton Institute can see 3 waves of nuclear as we go forward: a small number of big plants like Hinkley C and Sizewell C, a series of small modular reactors rolled out perhaps through the 2030s, and beyond that, more advanced smaller reactors, perhaps with technology that is currently in the development stage, but looking at not just providing electricity, but looking how those high temperature reactors can provide heat for industry, homes, and so on, but also generating hydrogen really efficiently, because high temperature heat can be used to make hydrogen directly in a much more efficient and cost competitive way than some of the routes we have at the moment. And my last question was when, and unsurprisingly, the answer to that, well, ideally the answer to when would have been about 20 years ago, but the second best time, given that we didn't do it 20 years ago, is to start doing it much more with much more commitment now. We need a national commitment. We have a national commitment to net zero by 2050, and we need to see movement on nuclear very quickly. Somebody pointed out to me that in 18 months' time, we'll be halfway between the millennium and 2050. And that really made me stop and think, because I remember the millennium pretty well. I'm 61, but I remember the millennium fairly well. And it's scary to think we're halfway between now, almost halfway between that point and our net zero commitment. And we're really still struggling with what I would call the low-hanging fruit of the electricity sector. We've got a lot more work to do. Almost all our large-scale electricity will need to be replaced by then, except perhaps Sizewell B, if that gets a lifetime extension. But we'll also need, as has been said before, to decarbonise transport, domestic heating industry, and so on. So we'll need much more electricity. Mike mentioned an electricity sector 3 times the size of the one we have now, and I think that's probably realistic. So we're going to need much more than we have today, and all of that essentially has to be zero carbon if we're going to hit net zero. So my message is, yes, we need nuclear, not instead of anything else, but as well as the other things, simply because we can't have full confidence that those other tools in the toolbox can deliver on their own. And I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion, and happy to take them either now or at the end of the presentations.
Adrian, thank you very much. Very clear, stimulated lots of questions. You will be familiar with, I'm sure you could guess, I'm sure you could guess what some of the topics of some of those questions are, but we're not going to do them just yet. Because we're going to let Jack come in and talk about hydrogen, and then I will put the questions to all 3 of you. So Jack, thanks very much for being here. I knew Jack when he worked for the Conservative Environment Network, which I'm a member of. He's now at the think tank Onward as head of energy and climate. And we specifically asked him to talk about hydrogen because it comes up a lot from constituents. It's coming up in the chat today, has a lot of parliamentary champions. So we thought it would be good if he focused on that alongside nuclear and wind. So Jack, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, David. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I don't have any slides, unfortunately, but I thought I'd just chat away, basically, give a kind of a quick run through of hydrogen, what it is, what the current government's policy is, where we are on it, etc. And then I'll move us on to questions and discussion, because that's always my favourite bit. So what is hydrogen? So it can be a zero carbon gas. And I say it can be a zero carbon gas because it very much depends on how you produce it. At the moment, all the hydrogen that we use, and I'm going to use the technical term of 27 terawatt hours, which the only way I can really try and put that into context is by saying we currently use about 400 to 500 terawatt hours of gas in general in the country, I think. So we're using a sliver of hydrogen, and we mostly use it for stuff like fertilizer production or refining oil. We don't use very much of it. But at the moment, we produce this hydrogen by basically shooting steam at methane and spitting it off. I'm not very top heavy on my science, despite being head of energy and climate. I'm more into my economics and politics. But basically, it's called steam methane reformation. Now we can have low carbon hydrogen, if we were to do the same process. So using burning fossil fuel gas, using the steam to reform methane into hydrogen. If we were to capture the carbon using carbon capture technology, then that would be low carbon hydrogen. And then if we were to produce hydrogen by passing electricity from a zero carbon source, so that might be a nuclear power station, it could be a wind turbine through water, then we get green hydrogen, which is zero carbon because there was no carbon in producing the hydrogen and there's no carbon when you burn the hydrogen. So why would we use hydrogen? So for one, obviously no fossil fuels that come from it when you burn it. And then that means that we can use it in our way to net zero. And the Climate Change Committee has made it very, very clear that we are going to need some hydrogen to decarbonize the economy, because you want to do as much as you possibly can using especially renewables, but also nuclear power, basically carbon-free electricity. And you can do that by electrifying your transportation by switching over to electric vehicles, for instance, or you can do it by electrifying your heat by going over to heat pumps. But there's some things which basically electricity just can't do, and you need gas to do it, and that's where hydrogen comes in. The other reason that we want to go for hydrogen, of course, isn't just to help us tread lighter on the planet. It's also to increase our energy security. So whether or not you care about climate change, I imagine most people here do, but the fact is that the UK is running out of gas in the North Sea, which is historically where we've got a lot of our gas from, and we don't really have any viable alternatives. So we're ever more reliant on buying our gas from international markets. So we currently ship in a lot from the Middle East in the form of liquefied natural gas. We'll bring a lot of fracked gas over from the US. But the problem is with that is that you're then competing with other countries to keep us warm, essentially, because that's what we tend to use gas for predominantly. So this winter, we're going to have British homes competing with factories in India and China to try and keep ourselves warm, and that means that we can't really control the price of gas, and we're running out of domestic source, like I said. So by ramping up this source of zero carbon gas, we're not only helping ourselves get to net zero, but we're also increasing our energy security. So the government is obviously naturally very, very keen on this. It sees hydrogen as a way to maintain a lot of the jobs in the North Sea for oil and gas workers, for instance. It also sees it as a kind of a route to reindustrialization in the UK. And so a few years ago, it brought out its hydrogen strategy. And the big policy there was that the government was going to aim to have 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2030. It's all quite new technology, so it requires scaling up. I'm not quite sure how to visualize 5 gigawatts, but essentially it wasn't enough. So the government decided to double it as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine. They went, right, we're going to need even more energy security than we previously realized. So we're going to basically lift all of our energy security targets. So they moved offshore wind from 50 gigawatts from 40 gigawatts by 2030 to 50 gigawatts by 2030. They said that they wanted more floating offshore wind, so they went from 1 gigawatt by 2030 to 5 gigawatts by 2030. They also increased the targets for solar capacity, so they went from, can't quite remember, but basically up to a 70 gigawatts by 2035. And then another one was, and of course, all the nuclear targets as well. So 25% of our electricity coming from nuclear by 2050, I think the target was. And part of that was expanding our hydrogen production target by another 5 gigawatts, so doubling it essentially by 2030. Now, it's a big ask, and it's quite a radical policy. And what they have done is made half of that hydrogen has to be green hydrogen as well. So at the moment, the energy bill is going through Parliament. Last I saw, I think the committee stage had just ended, and in the energy bill, it has all the regulatory and legislative frameworks to basically grow a hydrogen industry. Because, like I said, this is kind of, well, we do have hydrogen in their economy already. It's kind of a new thing that countries are suddenly going for it to be sort of a primary way to use energy. I'm trying not to go into this strange debate about whether hydrogen should be counted as an energy source or an energy vector, because that's just a bit too nerdy. yeah, it's the energy bill is basically going to put in all the frameworks for a big industry to grow. And then alongside that, the government is saying, where are we going to start supporting this hydrogen industry from to basically grow up in the UK? And the first 2 places that they've chosen is a northwest cluster, so that's around Manchester and Liverpool, called HyNet. And then they're also backing a second cluster on the east coast, which has both Teesside and Tees Valley, and then Humberside, and they're sort of connecting together to create a hydrogen cluster. There are a few others as well. I know the Scottish cluster, which is Aberdeen and Grangemouth, I think. They're on the reserve track, and hopefully they'll be getting support too to grow hydrogen up there. But I think that decision is still on the way. I think one of the most important debates, though, in the hydrogen space is how are we going to use our hydrogen? Because if you were to use hydrogen as a straight swap for heating, for example, we're going to need to produce a hell of a lot more hydrogen than we're currently planning to do. And the thing with producing hydrogen is, if you're going to do it in a zero carbon way, then you're going to have renewables doing that, and nuclear power stations. And the problem with that then is that you need to build way more renewables than we're currently planning to do, because rather than just having the electricity go from an offshore wind farm to a heat pump, you're having offshore wind farm, electrolyzer, put it all into storage, and then get it to the house and then use it that way. And it's just a bit less efficient. So you need to have way more energy production capacity if you're going to do it. Also, if you're to do a nationwide rollout for heat, you'd have to basically import fossil fuel gas from the US and the Middle East, and then turn that into hydrogen, and then use that for heating in homes, which would be just not good for the climate, basically. So yeah, people are sort of, well, much of the sector is quite resistant, or much of the climate sector at least is quite resistant against a nationwide rollout for hydrogen for heat. It doesn't feel like an efficient way of doing it, but where it really is efficient is basically big things that are really tricky to decarbonize with electricity alone. And this is where you're sort of looking at your planes, your heavy industry, big ships, things like that. So the idea being, if you're gonna have a small amount of hydrogen, where can we make sure it's used to deliver the best results for the planet? And I think my general rule is, the bigger the thing, the more likely it is that it's going to make sense to use hydrogen. So probably not your boiler or your car, but definitely your massive factory or your jumbo jet. It's a very, very crude way of putting it. So at Onward, and I should have introduced us properly at the start, at Onward, we're a kind of broadly mainstream centre-right think tank, but we're very much into policies for the next generation and increasing national resilience. Done a lot of work on levelling up and getting to net zero and restoring our social fabric. But we did a report recently on the hydrogen levy. So this is in the energy bill. It's how the government is going to fund its mechanisms to support the growth of the hydrogen industry in the UK. It's based on the very, very successful mechanisms that the UK led with to grow the offshore wind sector. So a bit like a contracts for difference. But what we said in the report is that it's a mistake to raise the revenues from people's energy bills to fund support for hydrogen, because while we desperately need hydrogen, and it's absolutely right, the government is being very ambitious with its target, because we don't think it's economic and therefore probably isn't going to be being used to heat homes. It's not fair to ask homes to pay for that hydrogen, essentially, and that's led to a pretty direct and rapid impact on the government's policy on this, which we're very pleased with. And Labour MPs were citing our report, which was quite funny for me as a Conservative. But yeah, we were very pleased, and overall, I've been very happy with where hydrogen policy is at the moment. So I'll leave it there, and if we can go to discussions and questions, then I think that might be the best thing to do.
Great, thank you very much, Jack. Again, very clear and compelling presentation. I'm going to try and get through as many of these questions as I can. So I'm going to ask you, Mike and Adrian, to be quite quick in your answers. So far, there are disproportionately more questions about nuclear than anything else, which is not.
I've been typing away and trying to answer some as we go, but they're coming in quicker than I can shovel them out.
Not entirely surprising, but some of the questions are quite similar. And to be fair, the way it's set up, people can't see each other's questions, so they are sometimes asking questions that have already been asked, but they wouldn't know that. So, Jack, I'm going to start with you. It's a question John asked earlier, but we didn't get to it with Grant. So John says, many days last winter, wind produced under 4% of power, solar produced under 2% of power. We need total backup with gas and coal. How do you deal with that problem?
Actually, so this is actually something I should have talked about in my introduction about hydrogen, is that we can use hydrogen for that. So yeah, we did have that 2 week. There's a German word for it called a Dunkelflaute, which is basically there's an anticyclone over the UK. There's no wind, and it's in the winter, so there's no sun. It's quite rare that we get sun in this country. We've had quite a good run over the past few weeks, I know. But yes, no, this is absolutely the next frontier, I think, of the transition to a clean energy system. Is how do you store renewable energy for a matter of weeks, possibly even months. And there's lots of cool technologies which are being scaled up. There's one which uses air, essentially, which I can't explain, but it's very, very cool. We should all go and check it out. It's called High View Power, I think, are looking into it. But hydrogen, what you can do is when the wind is blowing too much, and wind farms are actually paid to switch off, which sounds bizarre, I know, but they do sometimes have to get paid to switch off, because otherwise they'll overload the grid. What you can do is instead is build a hydrogen electrolyzer, and then that wind farm then has somewhere to put its electricity instead of just paying it to switch off, and then you'll have like a load of hydrogen which you can then burn later in a zero carbon way in either retrofitted gas stations or newly built H2 stations. So that is essentially where we have to go next. It is a very big challenge. They've kind of got like, how do you build the grid infrastructure that we need first? And then we've got this storage problem as well. But essentially, yeah, hydrogen is the way to do that. And that is actually alongside decarbonising your big things like big ships, big planes, big factories. The other brilliant use for hydrogen, which is absolutely what we should prioritise, is long-term energy storage.
Thank you very much, Jack. Even quicker answers than that. So Mike, Anonymous asks, with offshore wind farms, the vibrations from turbines have been proved to confuse sea mammals such as dolphins and whales. With onshore wind farms, migratory and coastal birds can get caught in wind turbines and are injured / die. What is done to ensure and reduce as little damage as possible done when building wind farms?
So I think the first thing to say is that domestic cat is far more responsible for deaths of birds in this country than anything else. So we just need to be quite careful about technologies. The first bit of work that was done in the US looking at bird damage from wind turbines found out that it was the grid lines that were killing birds, condors in particular, and not the wind turbines, and they run all over the state. So we need to get a right perspective. The other point is that with climate change, we're going to see drastic changes in our bird population anyway. So we need to have the right context in our mind. What is done? Well, the main problem with is an installation actually for offshore wind turbines is the piling, and so there are various technologies, bubble curtains and things like this, vibration piling and things like this, to try and reduce that noise. So we recognise that as an industry as something that we've got to sort. So that's one of the key things. The other thing is, yeah, if we don't decarbonise, we're in a real bad trouble. And obviously, wind farms have an environmental impact like anything else. I would say that the industry itself is aiming to decarbonise completely by 2050. So, and part of that is to get steel from facilities, and we hope that, for example, Port Talbot steel can be produced using hydrogen because you need the high temperature heat for it. So that's a part answer, I think.
Okay.
David.
Okay, thank you. So Adrian, as you might imagine, a couple of questions about nuclear waste. So Sue asked about, is it the case that it'll be 300,000 years that nuclear waste lasts for? Is society going to hold together long enough for that? And Jarrett asks, are communities being incentivized to allow the waste to be stored close to them, given it's so hazardous, given it lasts thousands of years? What's the plan to ensure that we can store it near people safely?
Sure. So taking those in turn, there are some types of, the nuclear waste is not a single thing. It's a category of different materials, some of which decay away very quickly, some of which take many thousands of years to decay. One helpful thing is that the things that the elements that are the most radioactive are the ones that decay the quickest. That is actually why they are the most radioactive. I liken it sometimes to shaking up a bottle of carbonated drink. If you shake it up and open the top, it's very fizzy, but it goes flat very quickly. If you just unscrew the top, it'll sit there bubbling away for ages, but you won't get as much fizz out of it, if you like. All of the packaging and the materials that are designed to manage that nuclear waste are designed to make sure that it is safely contained for as long as it is hazardous. And the plan is for the higher level waste to store it deep underground with multiple layers of containment around an ultimate disposal facility. And that brings us on to the second question about where that will be. The government is currently going through a process to seek volunteer communities. The process for finding a location, a community that will host that repository, is based on a volunteerism approach. And that means the government has committed that no community will have it unless that community explicitly decides that they want it in what's called a test of public support. That will take place in probably around 15 to 20 years time. There's a process going on at the moment with 4 communities who have expressed interest and have formed what are called community partnerships to investigate that possibility of hosting that material underneath their community. Or actually, they're all relatively coastal communities, so the land works, the entranceway would be inland in those communities, and the plan, I think, in all 4 cases is that the repository itself would be built out under the sea. 3 of those are in West Cumbria, close to Sellafield, where a lot of that existing nuclear waste is already safely stored above ground. So that would minimise the transportation issue. The other community that have stepped forward so far are in Lincolnshire, with no history of previous nuclear activity on a disused gas field in Lincolnshire. All of those 4 communities are currently receiving funding for being part of the process. So they receive funding to allow them to investigate and learn from sources who they identify and they trust about the answers to all of the many questions that they have, as well as seeking information from the regulatory authorities and the nuclear industry. And that sum of money will go up as they remain longer in the process. It's £1 million a year, I think, at the moment. Once they start, should they start drilling boreholes to test the geology in any location, that goes up to £2.5 million per year for the community to spend as they wish. And should a community decide that ultimately they do want to host it, then there would be a significant package of community investment that would come with that repository. So, okay. Short answer to a very complex question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stick with you a minute and then go to Mike. So I've lost Jack. There's a question about hydrogen, which I'll come back to, but I'm going to stick with you because he's coming back, but I'll just do these anyway, because there's a couple of questions on the financing. So Phil says, I understand with Hinkley it was £92.50 per megawatt hour, and it will be indexed up, so it's actually much more than the cost of renewables. And Mike says financing nuclear through the regulated asset base means consumers pay for it for many years before any power is produced, whereas no other power production technology gets that benefit. Is that fair? So A, is it in practice a lot more expensive than renewables? And B, isn't it getting an unfair advantage on some of them, given that?
So I think on the first question about Hinkley, I haven't done the comparison directly with renewables. What I do know is the strike price for Hinkley, which is basically an agreement between EDF, the developer, and government, agreed about 10, if not more years ago now, when the plant was first approved and set at £92.50 a megawatt hour, index linked. That is what EDF get for every unit of electricity, irrespective of what the market price does. So over the last 12 months or so, the market price has been an awful lot higher than that. And EDF, I was trying to, I typed it in an answer and then I rubbed it out again because I wasn't sure, but EDF made a comment recently that had Hinkley been running for the last 12 months, they would have been paying back, I think it was around £1.5 billion, 2 billion to the nation, because of that strike price is much less than the revenue that they would actually have received from the market. So a lot of people scoffed when that price was agreed. It was about 3 times the market price of electricity back at that time. People were very skeptical that energy prices were going to go up and it would look competitive, but they have done, and that currently looks a very good deal. Renewables will look a good deal as well, I'm sure. I'm not quite sure how the comparison works out. What I would say is Hinkley is a first of a kind, and the expectation is if we were to build more of those, because we've done it before, because the supply chain has already been through around that loop once, it would be cheaper, quicker, and more commercially viable to build the same plant a second or a third time. And that's the model that that's the expectation at Sizewell C, where even though the funding model is different, it will be essentially a replica of Hinkley C. In terms of paying in advance, it's finding a way that allows nuclear to be built without the investors having to put their hands into pockets which are simply not deep enough. And it comes down to whether as a nation we want to have nuclear or not. We've been through, I think, a different funding model for every proposed new nuclear plant in the last 15 years. Hopefully the regulated asset base, because it was put together in a consultation with developers and investors, is something that can be stable and predictable and can work to deliver us a number of new nuclear stations in future. And if we're committed to net zero, I believe we need to find a way to deliver nuclear alongside renewables and everything else.
So I'd just like to come in on that. Things are indexed. That most things are expressed in a 2012 price, just for comparison. So I think that 92p was expressed in the 2012 price. At the moment, the allocation round for renewables, just to give you a feel, the minimum price set for the current allocation round, which was things built in 2024, for offshore wind is £44. So half of nuclear, roughly speaking. So the question is, do you go for nuclear or do you go for something like much more offshore wind, but with much more hydrogen storage, as Jack explained? And that could be cheaper. We know the price of batteries, for example, comes down, but batteries are only a short-term storage, whereas hydrogen production is a longer-term storage. And looks, so that's
I'd say go for both.
Yeah, but it's a type of decision you have to make, and we know that the offshore wind capacity we're anticipating is still huge. It's huge coming down the line. So whether we just know that that's huge. How much nuclear contributes will still be a fairly small fraction. Grant was talking about 16%, but that's only electricity, and we just know that electricity is going to go up 3 times. I think nuclear, whatever you think of it, it's going to be a small fraction. Whether you think that's worth paying for or not, it's a political decision, I guess, David.
I guess.
Well, I'm not in charge,
Yes.
but yes. Look, Mike, just sticking with you, I'm going to let this run a few more minutes because of the break next anyway. I think this was a question for Grant, but just be interested in your views, which was about the restrictions on new onshore wind projects being lifted.
I have to say, I don't quite understand. What the industry wanted was just the removal of a ministerial statement that added greater requirements to onshore wind as opposed to anything really. And there seems to be discussions where they're been proposing a new ministerial statement, which goes part the way to reducing stuff. But if you're going to go to the trouble of trying to develop a wind farm, it's a risky business. Most wind farms that are looked at start, well, when you're in the development process, quite a level of attrition. People want to feel more comfortable, and people might say, actually, I'm going to go and develop it in Germany rather than in the UK or somewhere else, so that's just the facts of markets, I'm afraid.
Can I ask you what you think? I mean, it's not part of political event, this, but obviously the Labour Party said that they'd stop local communities being able to oppose wind farm. Projects like big wind farms, they would just.
Yes. So
what's your view of that?
I think we should go back to the old system we had, which was really. You had a planning system. We've all got the planning system. It worked. People could test whether something was sensible. Planning permission for wind farms got denied in quite a lot of instances. But then there's an appeals process which could be gone through, and that appeals process, roughly speaking, about half of things that went to appeal ultimately did get permission. And there were some local authorities who decided politically that they weren't even going to determine a wind applications. The problem with what I think Grant's saying is that only communities that really want them will get them, but then there are other communities around the country who would have a better wind resource. So it just doesn't seem, it seems sensible to go where the wind resource is good and the grid connections are good, rather than leaving it up to. I mean, you wouldn't leave nuclear up to that. It just seems odd to treat onshore wind in such a different way. That's my view, and I'd just like to see a sort of level playing field returned. The industry has good practice. It ought to be tested against that. The planning process does do it.
May I come in on that very, very quickly?
You can, and then I want you to answer a question Stu has asked, which is whether you think hydrogen should be reserved for steel manufacture, places where we need really hot heat. So yeah, come in on that and then answer that question.
So on the basically lifting the de facto ban on onshore wind, I do think the government needs to do it. The problem is that politicians often, it's not that rational for them to support that, because basically the opposition to development, and it's not just onshore wind, it's new houses as well, is very, very loud in politicians. I'm saying politicians because it's councillors and also MPs. The opposition is so much louder than the vast majority of people who just kind of passively accept it. But we've got a report out soon, very soon, which is basically saying lift the ban, but just make it much more tangible local community benefits, free community benefits, because then you start seeing the tangible benefits delivered to local communities that they will miss out on otherwise. And basically we're just trying to flip it, so rather than having a passive majority in support and a very active, very loud but small minority of people opposing, and it is small, it's like single digits people who oppose renewables outright, you basically just need to flip that on its head and to come up with a green energy covenant, as we're calling it, to really underline that if you accept development, which is in the national interest, by securing our energy supplies, tackling climate change, bringing on cheaper sources of power, then you will get investment, and most importantly, communities will get to decide what that investment goes into. And it might be cool stuff like, home upgrades. It could be energy bill rebates. Doesn't always work, actually. I think people are putting too much emphasis on energy bill rebates. But yeah, do look out for that report. That's my plug. We're hopefully getting out in the next couple
I was just going to say, Westmill pays tax like everybody else. It does pay into the local economy before any of these benefits that you also mentioned, and I think the industry is very keen to ensure that they happen. And we also, as an industry, want the best wind farms to go forward as well. So exactly, we're not, we agree with planning permission and that process in principle. It seems just so, unnecessarily biased. That's my concern.
This is God, I just want to get a couple more in, Jack. So because we are a bit over time, so and you may not have a view on this, Adrian and Jack, but who was it? Somebody can't remember the name. Is somewhere here. It was Doug. Mike had a hydrogen priority ladder on his slides. Do either of you disagree with that? If you saw it, I know, Adrian, you had trouble with your connection, but if you saw it, do you have any points of disagreement with it? And then for each of you, again, anonymous has asked, I'm interested on views about the role vehicle to home and vehicle to grid in terms of renewable energy storage. There are going to be a huge number of large car batteries potentially available. So the hydrogen priority ladder on Mike's slide, that's for Adrian and Jack, and then for all of you, vehicle to home, vehicle to grid for renewable energy storage.
So hydrogen ladder, I do agree, like in theory, but it's just very difficult to actually implement that ladder in reality, because there's going to be thousands of businesses using hydrogen. It's not like you can specifically demand that each bit of gas goes to each one, but you have to basically put in good market signals to direct hydrogen into the best uses of it. And yes, steel production is one of them, but just general heavy manufacturing is going to be really important to have hydrogen. In terms of steel production, it's not so much that we're going to be going down the Swedish route of using hydrogen for steel production. I imagine actually in the UK, it's probably going to be electric arc furnaces, which is very big in the US, and carbon capture and storage. But we will still need hydrogen for steel production and other heavy emitters in the heavy industry. In terms of vehicle to grid, I'm very up for it. Basically, it's using the entire nation's car fleet as a massive battery. You'll be able to sell energy back, like suck it in when it's cheap and there's lots of wind, and then sell it back to the grid when there's not so much wind. That's absolutely fantastic. And yes, we absolutely do need to be cracking on with that. And not to get too political, but Ofgem need to get on with it, basically.
Right, Adrian?
Yeah, I did see the hydrogen ladder. I thought it was a really interesting graphic. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about hydrogen to know whether it's right or not. I'll trust others on that, but I thought it was interesting and insightful. I think the big question for me is just to think about, where do we get the hydrogen from? Because hydrogen has to come from somewhere else that requires energy of some sort. So unless we're making hydrogen in a way that is carbon free and on a large scale, and I can offer you a large scale carbon free or low carbon source of electricity and heat that can do that, and particularly with those advanced high temperature reactors that I mentioned, that high temperature heat that they produce as well as electricity can be a really efficient way of making large scale hydrogen in future. I'm equally not an expert in the vehicle to grid and so on issues, but what I do know is whenever you're transferring energy from one source to another, it's always less than 100% efficient. So the more that we rely on storage, whether it's direct, dedicated storage or some of those other forms of storage, there is inefficiencies somehow built into that, and we shouldn't rely on too much of that. We know that in the future, if we have vast quantities of low carbon electricity, we can put that to good use. Not just on the things we're using electricity for today, but on the things that we need to decarbonize and turn electric, whether that's transport or heating or industry or everything else. So I think until we are very sure we can do that without nuclear, we should be making sure we're doing it. We're putting nuclear in place to be one part of that low carbon future for 2050 or thereabouts.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Mike?
Vehicle to grid, yeah, complete no-brainer. And it's a shame that various chargers are being installed these days that aren't able to cope with that type of retrospective functionality. Any charger should be able to cope with back charging into car batteries and back out. And it's great that people are going to buy tons of these things that can be used in a very positive way to help stabilize the grid.
Right. Well, look, Mike, Adrian, Jack, thank you very much indeed. Really good session. We've gone 10 minutes over, but there were lots of questions. I knew people found it very interesting. We are going to have a 5-minute break now, so we will start just 5 minutes later. We're due to start at 3:40 with this next session, but it'll be on water quality and tackling storm overflows, which is obviously a very hot topic at the moment. So please make yourselves a cup of tea or something. Be back here in 5 minutes, and we will have that session on water quality. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Now, one of the topics that has been higher on the agenda than a lot of things in the past year is water quality and storm overflows. And on the one hand, that's been a good thing because we do need to focus on this. On the other hand, there's been a lot of misinformation about what has happened and what MPs, including my own party, have done. Although I know any of you who've looked at this closely will know it's misinformation, but unfortunately, some of what goes around on Twitter and so on is not very helpful to what we're trying to do and what we're trying to fix. So I wanted to have a session on water quality, and I invited lots of different organizations actually to be here on this panel so that we had quite a balanced discussion. And I'm afraid most people, for various reasons, couldn't do the date or the time, but Richard from Thames Water very kindly did so. So I'm grateful to him for sort of stepping into what may be partly the firing line, although I'm sure it will be very respectful. He's Director of Sustainability at Thames Water. I've obviously had quite a number of conversations with Thames Water about a whole range of things, including the reservoir proposal, raising the concerns that constituents have about that. That's not the topic for today. So he will talk for a while about this issue of water quality and how we tackle storm overflows, and then we'll get through as many questions as we can. And hopefully we'll be in a sort of better informed position by the end of it. So Richard, thank you very much for being the one who could be here, and over to you. I think you're on mute still.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, David, and thank you also for taking the time to come and have a proper look at Wantage Sewage Works for yourself. I thought that was a really useful couple of hours, and what I'm going to cover today is quite a bit of what we covered then, really. I know some people know all this, but a lot of other people don't, and I'm not quite sure who's in the audience. I'm going to run through this and then take questions afterwards. My starting point is that for many years, Thames Water and the rest of the industry took the view that occasional discharges of untreated sewage into rivers were not by any means a good thing, but that was the way the system was designed, and it was quite difficult to do anything about it. Now, 3 years ago, we changed our position completely on that. A new chief executive, Sarah Bentley, came in, and we discussed this, and she took the view that actually it's completely unacceptable, and we should say so. So her view was we needed to speak up, say it was unacceptable, open up, make our data available to anybody who wanted it, and get on above all with cleaning up. So this is really a chance for me to explain what happens and why, and then we can get on to looking at answering questions. If I can just try and share my screen, which I've never tried to do on Zoom before. Now, I hope you can see that. Does that come through?
Yes, it has. Yeah, it has. It could do with you putting it on PowerPoint mode so that we can see the full slide, but otherwise, yes. Slideshow.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to use aerial photographs to tell the story. And this is a typical small sewage treatment works. It happens to be Kintbury in West Berkshire, so not in your constituents, I'm afraid, David, but it's a very easy one to explain to people what happens, and the principles are the same at any works. And it's actually easier to small works because big ones, everything's covered up and there's lots of recirculation. So this is nice and straightforward. So if we start with the inlet works, so this receives flows from 2 pumping stations, one in each of 2 local villages, and all of their sewage is pumped up to the works. That's about 3,500 people in total. And at the inlet works, we just screen out all the things that our lovely customers send that we don't want. So you saw this yourself, David, at Wantage. This is where everything except pee, poo and paper gets screened out. So the wet wipes, the sanitary products, the condoms, the nappies, the pairs of tights, the old tea towels, the toothbrushes, all of that we can't treat. It has to be physically screened out at the inlet works, because if it once gets into the works, it clogs everything up. From the inlet works, we go to the primary settlement tanks. And what happens there is we just slow the flow down. By the time sewage gets to us, it's a pretty homogenized, thin, porridgey mixture. And what happens here is the solids settle out to the bottom. They're mechanically scraped away and then taken off for as sludge for energy generation in a separate process. So once that physical separation has taken place, we've now got reasonably clean water, but it has not yet had biological treatment. So it goes to 3 what we call filter beds. They don't actually do any filtering. What they are is they're full of clinker, which has a very high surface area. So lots of space for air and for bacteria to grow. And those bacteria create a biofilm on the surface, which when we sprinkle through the rotating arms, the sewage works its way down about 3, 4, maybe 5 meters down through the clinker. And in doing so, we remove a large proportion of the polluting load. Basically, we get rid of most of the ammonia at this point. And that's one of the worst things you can put into a river. So once it's been through those 3 filter beds, it's now actually pretty clean, but it goes to a final settlement tank, sometimes called a humus tank. Here we again just slow it down, and the particles, which are sort of talcum powder size by this point, settle out down to the bottom of the tank, and they are also scraped away to go off for energy generation. Now, since this photo was taken, we've put in an additional treatment stage, which is a polishing of the final effluent so that it is really not just clean, but sparkling before it gets discharged into the river, or in this case, the canal at point 4. This is the Kennet and Avon Canal. Now, that's a biological process. It takes about 10 hours from arriving at the inlet works to getting into the water course. And it runs perfectly naturally all the time. The problem comes that the works can only take a certain amount of sewage at any one time. If you try and push it through faster, it will be like taking the Sunday joint out of the oven after half an hour. It's not cooked, and you'd end up with the process occurring in the river, or in this case, the canal. So what happens is when the works is full, when it's receiving its full flow that it's required to take under its permit, any additional flow that comes in after heavy rainfall gets diverted to these 2, ignore number 5 for the minute, gets diverted to those 2 storm tanks. And those are basically a parking area for sewage. One fills and then the other one fills. And the aim is to hold the sewage there until such time as the incoming flows subside. You've got spare capacity, the pumps kick in automatically and pump from the storm tanks back to the inlet works where the process occurs, same as it does the rest of the sewage. The problem comes when your storm tanks are full, the works is at full capacity, and the sewage is still spewing in the door faster than you can cope with. What are you going to do? You can turn the pumps off in the villages and you'll flood the villages. You can allow it to keep going and it will go into the river partially treated and cause problems, or you can put sandbags in and you flood the site. None of those are remotely attractive options. So in those circumstances, the site has a permit which says when this is happening, and only if it's treating the required amount of flow, the storm tanks can overflow to the river at point 4. And that's the bit that we want to make unnecessary. Before I move on, I'll just say that 5 is the sludge holding tank. We hold the sludge there, it gets collected probably about once every 10 days for the size of this site and taken away for anaerobic digestion at our big energy generation sites, a big climate change benefit there. But why do the flows go up after rainfall? It's not because people are taking more showers or flushing the toilet more, obviously. It's because the rain is getting into the system. And it gets in a number of different ways. So the first one is the one you can see on the left there. That's what we call infiltration, the water getting in through cracks in the pipes. And that does happen, and we have to find it and we have to stop it. The problem with infiltration is it is not happening most of the time. You could put as many cameras down there as you like in dry weather, nothing to see. Wait until the pipes are absolutely full. Again, the camera doesn't see anything. So there's a relatively small window of opportunity as groundwater levels go up and down to find infiltration. But find it we do, and where we do, we can fix it either with a patch or potentially if it's a longer length of sewer, we can reline the whole thing by putting a new plastic pipe inside, heating it up, and then it molds to the contours that are there. But that's by no means the only way that rainwater gets into sewers. If we look on the right there, you've got a diagram of a house and the sewers underground. And you've got two separate networks of pipes. You've got the orange pipes, which are taking everything from the house. So that's the toilets, the baths, the washing machines, the showers, the dishwashers. All of that gets collected up and it goes into a foul water sewer, which goes to a sewage treatment works. And that's quite a small pipe. It's actually about the size of a grapefruit in diameter. And then you've got a surface water sewer. And the surface water sewer is much bigger, and it takes water off the roofs and any garden runoff, the streets, pavements, etc. And that is surface water. It's clean, and it goes to a watercourse, to a ditch, and ultimately to a stream and to a river. And we have this separate system almost everywhere in our area, except central London, and except right in the heart of some of the oldest towns, Reading and Oxford, for instance. But mostly we have separate systems. And that's fine, so long as they stay separate, because if the surface water sewer is somehow misconnected to the foul water sewer, the surface water, being much bigger, takes up the capacity we need in the foul water sewer, and either the sewer overflows out of a manhole, or it creates more flow than the sewage treatment works can cope with. So we have to be alert all the time to misconnections, which are done by well-meaning DIY people, by dodgy plumbers, sometimes by accident, and some historical connections by council. So we can find misconnections. We have to separate out that surface water, because that can make a big difference. We also have what we call inundation. So you can see a manhole cover there on the left, and you can see it's got these little notches. And you might think that's where you put your lever when you want to open the manhole cover. That's quite right, but they also have an important function. They allow the sewers to breathe. And that again is fine under most conditions, but if that manhole cover is under several inches of water, the water's going down through the manhole cover and into the sewers, and again taking up the capacity that we need. We also have physical damage. This is actually under a town in Buckinghamshire. The council put in electric charging points, and they put that one right through the middle of a sewer. It's a high groundwater area, and you can see that water would have been gushing in until we were able to discover it with a camera and get it fixed. We also have landowners who want to make a connection to drain a corner of a field or a parking area, and they find a pipe and they bang a hole through into it, expecting that that will be a surface water sewer and it'll take their surface water away. Unfortunately, in this case, it's a foul sewer, and their rainwater is filling up our sewer. So all of those things can make a big difference to the volume arriving at the sewage works. And when we have got more flow arriving than we can cope with, there's basically three things we can do. We can deal with the problem at source by removing the infiltration. But as I've explained, it's not easy to find. And if you look at a sewage works, let's say the size of Witney, 43,000 people served by Witney Sewage Works, 200 miles of sewers. So finding where the infiltration is happening is not easy. The second thing is you can build a bigger sewage works. And in many cases, we're doing that to cope with population growth and to give ourselves some headroom. The problem with that is if you make the works too big, it becomes very inefficient in dry weather. Sewage works likes a nice steady flow coming through all the time. It doesn't want to be constantly going up and down in volume. So you need to be careful you're not making the works too big to cope efficiently in dry weather. And the third thing is you can build bigger storm tanks at a sewage works. And that again sounds obvious. Why wouldn't you just build bigger storm tanks? Well, the problem is that if those storm tanks are being filled up by a one-off event like a sudden thunderstorm, actually like we just had here in Reading, that's fine because the bigger storm tanks will hold the more flow and you can empty them. But if the flow is coming from infiltration and you're getting more than you can cope every day, you'll quickly fill 1, 2, 3, as many storm tanks as you build. And the thing about storm tanks is easy to get them full, not so easy to get them empty. If you don't get them empty quickly, then they're no use to you because you haven't got that capacity. And the sewage that you're holding on to goes black and septic and stinking, and it's very difficult to deal with. So there's a balance at each site for what you need to do in terms of reducing the infiltration, more capacity, and more storage. If I go on and look at the overall picture for river water quality in the River Thames catchment, this is an Environment Agency diagram, and it's amalgamation for the whole River Thames catchment. And you can see there that the reasons for not achieving good ecological status, water industry, 31%. So we are the biggest single reason for not achieving good status, but you can also see agriculture, 26%, urban and transport, which basically means highway runoff, 19%. So we have to work together on these issues, and we have to look at what are the problems in each location, how are they being caused, what can we collectively do to fix the problem. As far as we're concerned, we've published a River Health Action Plan. We're now on version 2, and there's 3 main elements: discharge high quality treated effluent meets all the standards, no polluting discharges, so no accidents, no equipment failures, no blockages, and as I've just said, work with partners to improve river quality. And I would suggest you take a look at our River Health Plan. There's a lot in there, and we'd welcome feedback on it. It is an evolving piece of work. Now, if we look at the Wantage Didcot region, I haven't actually put the constituency boundary on here, but you can see in the area you've got big works at Wantage and Didcot particularly, and a number of smaller and medium-sized works. What we've done in terms of making more information available, I talked about speaking up. This is the opening up. So we published on the 1st of January an interactive live map of where discharges are taking place. And you can see, this is one I did for another presentation on a rather dry day. Most of the sites were green. There wouldn't be so many greens today after the heavy rain we've had. But what that map will show you is it will show anyone who's interested at the same time as we get the information where there's been a storm discharge. So typically within half an hour, maybe 45 minutes of anything happening, it will show on the map. And we've also now updated the map so that you can go to an individual site, click on it. It will tell you not only whether it's discharging or not, it will tell you when it last discharged, and it will tell you in general terms what our plans for any improvements at that site are. So there's 250 sites where our improvements are planned, and you can get some insight into them by looking at the map. So again, this has been really useful. It's produced a lot of good dialogue with parish councils, particularly local community groups, and we're always keen to talk to people about what's going on, but the map will show them. We have about 2,500 clicks on that map every day, and we also make the data available by what's called an API to anybody who wants to display it in their own format. We've got about 1,000 registered users on the API, so that's going well. If I look at what we've seen from our monitors for the spills, I'm not sure, I hope you'll be able to see this, but basically the blue bars are spills for 2020 discharges, green is 2021, and the grey is 2022. And it's a pretty mixed picture there, but if you look across our area in general, 2020 is the highest, then 2021, then 2022. That isn't because of any great action we've done. It takes longer than that to make the necessary changes. It's principally because 2020 was a very wet year, 2021 was average, and 2022 was unusually dry. So we had a low number. You can see the grey bars pretty low there everywhere except Drayton. And 2023 is shaping up to be a more average year. So we're going to have more overflows and more duration this year than last. But when you adjust it for weather, the trend is beginning to come down. Now, just looking at what's happening at the individual sites. So Stamford in the Vale, we've got an increase in capacity of storm tanks, £3 million being spent on that. That is virtually finished. So we'll be able to capture more storm sewage and reduce those big green bars you saw a minute ago. At Drayton, we're increasing treatment capacity from 43.3 to 57, so roughly 15% increase in treatment capacity at Drayton. We're also going to have bigger storm tanks there. South Morton, we're going to be upgrading That scheme's currently being designed. Across the whole catchment, we've got money available for catchment-wide actions with the catchment partnerships, things like improving water quality by reducing pesticides. We've made £22,000 contribution from our catchment partnership support fund to the OP catchment partnership last year, another 15,000 to come, and we're funding a £30,000 project led by the Freshwater Habitats Trust. So some work going on there. And then looking further forwards, Abingdon we know is going to need an increase in treatment capacity by about 2027 and Didcot by 2028. And finally, just in terms of working in partnership, there's a lot that we're doing across water catchments. We've been testing 3 in particular with a new approach, the chest, the crane and the even load, and that's going well. So we're going to be doing much more of this in the next business plan period. We're working on that now to see which catchments will join those 3. We've got 10-year catchment plans. And that's in addition to the essential maintenance and upgrades that I was talking about. So we've got 27 catchment partnerships in our area, and we want to get to about half of them having really detailed involvement, and then we'll work on the other half in the next 5-year period. So I'm conscious that's a very quick whistle-stop tour, which is what you asked for, David, and I'm now very happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Richard. That was very informative, and there have been quite a number of questions. So we will try and get through as many of these as possible. So if you could take your, yeah, there you go. You may not have read this, but the first question was, what do you think of the Cambridge Institute's report, Sink or Swim?
I haven't read that report, but I will do so. I can't give an immediate reaction to it. I'm sorry, but if it's about climate change, I recognise there's a climate emergency. We as a company do, and we have our net zero plans, which includes reducing our energy consumption and also very much increasing our energy generation. We currently create 25% of our own energy through renewable energy generation, and we'll be doing more of that.
Okay. Someone says here that Didcot has a model sewage works, and it's a great day out. When will all of them along the Thames be of that quality?
Well, it's a rolling programme of improving sewage works. So what we do is we look at the ones which are, the first thing is we absolutely have to meet all the requirements of our permits. So one of the things that we're doing is we're going through forensically looking at every aspect of every permit and making sure that, for instance, if it says that the storm tanks have to be 9,000 cubic meters, let's make sure they aren't 8,500. We are also making certain that we're meeting our standards for things like ammonia, suspended solids. But we're also looking ahead to cope with population growth. So we work very closely with district councils, West Oxfordshire in particular, to work out where the growth is going to happen and make sure that we can have our works, and where necessary our sewer networks, increased and ready to go before the development comes online. So there's a lot of work with councils. It's slightly complicated. We are statutory consultees on local plans, which is great. We are not statutory consultees on individual developments. So we rely on good liaison between the council officers and our developer services team so that we know what's coming and when it's coming. And we've been strengthening that because we know about the concerns for house building in the area, places like Grove, which obviously are a concern for everyone. And we're making sure that we've got the good information so that we can plan ahead.
And there will be some, at least one other question about housing development.
Sure.
Mark asks, how long will it take and how much will it cost to prevent untreated sewage reaching rivers and ultimately the sea? Obviously, the government sort of pushed the industry into sort of 56 billion investment, but Mark wants to know, how long will it take, how much will it cost to prevent untreated sewage reaching rivers and ultimately the sea?
Trying to eliminate every single discharge from every one of our sites is going to be a long job. Some of them, particularly Mogden in West London, where Mogden Sewage Works acts almost as a kind of auxiliary drainage system to prevent flooding in very wet weather. That's going to take a long time, but we're getting the number down, and we want to get it down as quickly as possible, and we want to prioritize the most sensitive catchments. So those are the ones which are triple SIs, chalk streams, upstream of bathing waters, etc. But generally the smaller rivers and the upstream end of rivers. And we're getting those down as fast as we can. So big improvements, places like Chesham, Fairford, Bourton on the Water, really sensitive catchments, but also more work going on in places like South Lee, Bampton. All of that work is coming forwards, but it's going to be an iterative process. I suspect that the next round of increases will get the number of discharges right down, but I don't think it'll get it to zero. We've got to use the available money from our customers, and we've got to spread it over time. But I think that we're looking probably to get every last discharge, we're looking decades ahead. But that doesn't mean that we can't. I mean, one of the things that happened when the government asked the industry how much would it cost? I mean, figures of 300 to 600 billion were being bandied about, and I'm afraid that in some quarters was taken as being, well, it's very difficult, very expensive, so let's do anything. That's absolutely wrong. Just because it's going to cost a huge amount to get every last discharge dealt with doesn't mean we can't get on and get numbers right down as quickly as possible.
So a few is it true questions. So is it true that if you didn't have storm overflows that were therefore releasing the water, releasing sewage into water, that it would back up into people's homes?
In general terms, it'll back up somewhere. It might be into somebody's home. It might come out of a manhole cover, and that manhole cover might be on the corner of a farmer's field. It might be a rugby pitch. It might be a school playground. So I think it's difficult to generalize. But if you didn't have, if you basically shut the door of the sewage works when you couldn't cope anymore, it's going to come out somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Is it true that so in countries like Austria and Switzerland, apparently you can get water clean enough to drink from sewage works? Is that true? Is that something we could have here?
I doubt you get it clean enough to drink direct from a sewage works. You can put it through an additional treatment in a recycling process and use that for drinking water. The problem is that a sewage works is not good at taking out bacteria, and it's particularly not good at taking out viruses. So if you really wanted to get everything out, you would have to use a drinking water process. Something like ozonation, possibly a carbon sandwich. We have tested this, we have done it, and it's technically possible, but it requires a big area, it requires a lot of chemicals, and it requires a lot of energy. So we would only generally do that where we were looking to recycle the water for drinking water. And again, it's a very expensive process and very energy intensive.
Right. Is it true that Thames unable to dilute any more sewage from increased development right at the point at which we started building 100,000 more homes? So have we sort of already?
No, we haven't. But it does mean that if we've got more homes, we're going to need more treatment capacity. And then you've also got to look at the total volume of treated effluent going into the river. Can the river cope with it? Particularly it's a very small river. And that may then mean much higher treatment standards as well. So, we do need to know where these big developments are coming and have time to make plans to deal with it.
Okay. How many of your works do not yet have monitoring on them?
We have monitoring on all our works which have the capacity to discharge, have a discharge permit. Some of our smaller sites are what are called treat all sites. So they are built to a larger, they're small sites, but they're built bigger than they otherwise would be, and everything gets treated. There's no capacity for storm discharge. Anything that's excess is held on site. Since they don't discharge anything that's untreated, they don't have a permit, and therefore they don't have a monitor. But everything that has the capacity to make a storm discharge now has a monitor, and that information is on the website.
Okay, thank you. And then a couple more questions, unless any others come in, although Kath has said that Sink or Swim report is about financing models for the future of water companies.
Okay, yeah, I think I do know the report, but I'm not the financing guru at Thames, I promise you.
No, you're Director of Sustainability, that's fine. So a couple more questions, but if anyone else wants to ask them, then get them in quick. The first is from Phil, and he says, over the last 10 years, what has restricted most of the required investment? Is it resources? Is it your regulator? Is it internal approvals at Thames Water? What is it?
Ultimately, it's the amount of money that we get from our customers. And the amount of money we get from our customers is set by an independent economic regulator whose job is to balance what customers are able to pay with what we as a business need to do. Now, companies can always spend a bit more, but ultimately, companies don't invest money unless they're going to make some kind of a return. Now, that may be a return in financial terms. It might be a return in getting higher performance, better reputation, more business, higher standards. But you've got to be able to see some kind of a reward. Otherwise, you wouldn't put your money into water. You'd go into roads or airlines or biotech or some other field of investment. And our investors are mainly pension funds, and they've got to make sure they make a return. But in every price review settlement, they happen every 5 years, the regulator works out what they think a well-managed company ought to need to spend. And that's the amount that they're prepared to fund through customer bills. And in each of the last 3 5-year periods, we've spent significantly more than that. When you spend more than the regulator's assumption, you don't make a return on it because it will be unfair on customers. So, we are spending, but I think what's interesting is that the strategic policy statement that the government has given to Ofwat for this price review is very clear that there needs to be more investment. And then it's a question of whether that investment should be in reducing storm discharges, which I'm sure it will, in increasing resilience, so making sure that we don't have big burst pipes, getting leakage down, reducing sewer flooding, building new water resources. So there's a lot big discussions to be had at a sort of societal level. What are the priorities for us to invest, and what will our customers be able to afford to pay for? And linked to that, we're doing a lot more in terms of making sure that those customers who will not be able to pay the extra amount are properly protected through social tariffs.
Thank you. Greg asks, now this, I don't know how much you will know about this, because this is about the Housing Infrastructure Fund development, but we'll give it a go. Are there plans for a capacity increase at Culham, where 3,500 houses are planned, and Berensfield, where 2,000 houses planned? And whether this Housing Infrastructure Fund project we have, which you'd be forgiven for not knowing about, but he's asking whether the viaduct will affect the water flow on the Thames. The question you might be able to answer, if you don't know the answer to that, you don't know the detail of HIF 1 and whether there are capacity increases planned for Culham and Berensfield. The question you might be able to answer is whether Thames Water is a statutory consultee on river crossings.
I don't believe we are on river crossings. That will be the Environment Agency. I've just skimmed through, and I've got here an upgrade is planned for Culham sewage treatment works. This will improve its ability to treat the volumes of incoming sewage, reducing the need for untreated discharges in wet weather. Scheme still being designed, due to complete in 2027. So I suspect that is in anticipation of the housing growth that your constituents just mentioned. But I'm sorry, I don't know the detail on Culham. And in terms of effects on river flow, that would generally be the Environment Agency who would be consulted on that.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try and interpret David's question, because I wasn't clear exactly what he's asking, but I think because it's in short form. But I think he's asking, when will the South Morton upgrade be? And he also asks, and you might need to go back to your slides for this, what happened in 2021 and then 2022? So I think that's it. I have asked him to clarify, but because it just says South Morton ...
Yeah, well, the South Morton scheme is still being designed and it's due to complete in 2025, and I suspect that's a reaction to those high levels of discharges in those 2 years. So my expectation is simply that there was, as I was showing from my aerial photographs, more sewage arriving at the site than it could treat, and very unfortunately, it had to be discharged to the river.
Okay. Some more coming in now. I have heard Ofwat prevents water companies from saying they cannot support yet another housing development. Is this true?
No, it's not true. We have a statutory duty to supply water. So it isn't a question of us saying we can't do it. We have to find a way of doing it. Otherwise, we're failing in that statutory duty. We're also, if the government decides that house building is going to go ahead, then I'm afraid, local authorities have to build roads and schools. We have to provide the water and the wastewater treatment. What we will do where necessary is say to a council, look, you've suddenly bounced us with another 1,000 houses. Actually, we've looked at our maps. We're going to have to build a bit of extra sewer. We may need to extend the sewage treatment works. And we sometimes ask for what's called a Grampian condition, which sounds a bit techie, but it's a planner's rule that says the council will grant permission subject to the houses not being occupied until we've had time to do a specific piece of work. It's quite complicated. We have to be able to do it within about 2 years, but it's the council that issues the planning permission, not Thames Water. We simply advise.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because the very next question is whether the Grampian condition should be to upgrade sewage works before building begins. Is that something that would help you?
Well, the way the Grampian condition works, it's on the developer that the houses shouldn't be occupied until the work has been done.
Yes.
And this is something that we're spending a lot of time discussing with councils now, because if we get to talk to them, we get to talk to developers, we can influence the phasing, and we can decide what is the best thing to do in the circumstances. So, I really understand the concerns about this. Discussions with district councils going on all the time. And please accept that they are happening. And if you've got questions, write to the council or write to us, and we'll try and explain what's going on. We do want to make sure that we've got the extra capacity before people move into those houses for obvious reasons.
Yeah, okay. Mark asked, will the additional load for new housing be charged back to the developers in, for example, section 106? I think he's probably talking about your sort of work. Yeah.
The situation is quite complicated in that all developers who connect to our networks pay an infrastructure charge. And those infrastructure charges are all put into a huge pot of money, which is then used to fund whatever upgrades are needed for the network. So that's the sewers, the water supply, the pumping stations. But if we actually have to build a bigger sewage works, then the cost of that goes through the business plan price review 5-year process with Ofwat, and is paid for by all our customers. So it's slightly tricky. The networks, the pipes are paid for by developers through a central charge. The sewage treatment works are paid for by customers spread across the whole area.
Daniel asks, are there any plans to change the system so that drinking water is not used for washing human waste down the sewers?
Well, we've been asking the government about this for a very long time, because there is tremendous opportunity for new developments to do what's called grey water recycling. This is where you take water that's been used for baths and showers, for instance, and rainwater off roofs, and you store it, and then you use it in a separate non-potable network for garden watering and car washing in particular. It can be done at an individual house scale, but it's quite expensive and it's a bit risky with Legionnaire's disease and things. But really, where there's the opportunity, is where you've got a new development. You could building 100 houses, you can build a big tank, you can apply some basic treatment, and you can give people a dual network. Unfortunately, building regulations haven't been insisting on this. House builders don't think it's worth doing. And we've actually changed our tune on this. And rather than trying to get building regulations changed, we're now saying to developers, if you build really water efficient homes, we'll give you £1,000 off the connection charge. And if you build water neutral homes, £2,000. And this is incentivizing developers to build the kind of houses we want them to build. And if I just one good thing I should say about Rebecca Powell and the government is that we've been trying for 15 years to get a white goods labelling system for water efficiency, and we are about to get that. So that's a real step forward. But whoever asked the question is absolutely right. There's a big opportunity around grey water recycling, and it's around big new developments. And the problem is convincing the developers it's a good thing to do. There is also, I should say, a knock-on problem in that you have to educate people very carefully about the dual network. If they fill the paddling pool with the rock from the wrong hose, you can get very sick children. So you know, it's not absolutely straightforward, but at a development level, it can be done.
I'm going to just do a couple more. So David came back and clarified, asked if we could get a copy of the slides. This session is obviously recorded, David.
Yep, happily send your office a copy of the slides.
Yeah, so we can give you a copy, but also you'll be able to watch this back because the whole thing will go on my website. But he actually said that South Moulton was very high in 2021 and then very low in 2022.
Yeah,
and he wondered why that had happened.
That would be because 2022 was a drought year, and I suspect it's affected by high groundwater levels. And of course, groundwater levels were very low in the year, so they wouldn't have had the extra flow into the site that would have caused the discharges. And there are a number of surge works. Winterbourne is another one. There are several where Hampstead Norris, where people have said, how can it go from 50 discharges to 0 in a year? And it's simply to do with the amount of rainfall. This is a rainfall driven phenomenon, and it affects some works more than others, depends on the local geology.
And then your final two questions, which is just as well, because the final one will open up a Pandora's box. So we're going to ask you the question, and then we're going to immediately end the event on time at 4:30, or ish. So the first question is, have the costs of treating sewage gone up in recent years? For example, have the cost of chemicals gone up? The second question is, can you comment on our national reservoir strategy and whether we have enough online for our future population and climate?
Okay, so the cost of treatment has gone up because we're being required to treat to higher standards. So, for instance, a lot of our works now have maximum levels of phosphorus that we can discharge to a river. Typically, phosphorus without any what we call phosphorus stripping would be in the sewage going in, it would be 15 milligrams per litre coming into the works, going into the river at 5 to 8 milligrams per litre. We then install phosphorus stripping to get down to 2 milligrams per litre, which is what we've typically been doing. And to do that, you have to use chemicals. But now we're being asked to get to 0.25 milligrams per litre, which is really very, very tight standard, and it means a lot more chemicals. So our costs of ferric are going up, and also in some cases extra treatment means in order to get rid of the ammonia, you've got to put air in. Putting air in generally requires pumping, unless you've got big areas of space for those filter beds that I showed you. Quite often you have to do it in a smaller footprint, so you've got higher pumping costs. National reservoir strategy, I think we've got a lot to do on water resources. There's a big discussion about what is the best value, both for the customers who have to pay for the water and for the environment. And I don't think there's one sort of silver bullet. So I think you've got to have more transfers. But transfers on their own won't solve the problem. You've also got to have more storage. I think in some areas you've also got to have more reuse. And that actually is the process that, as you know, David, is going on with the water resource planning at the moment, is looking with our regulators at which options make most sense. And we're also, as you know, moving away from individual company plans. They still exist, but it's all the regional plans that are the big drivers of this to make sure we're making the best use of water, both regionally and nationally.
Richard, thank you very much. That is, you know, Thames Water is rightly in the spotlight a lot, and particularly in the last couple of weeks. So I'm very grateful to you for keeping this commitment. I think whether people agreed with everything you said or not doesn't really matter, because it was very informative, and you've answered every question that you've been given. So thank you very much for that, and for giving up your time. And thank you to all for attending. That was the last session of this year's summit. I'm sorry we couldn't have one more. We just weren't able to get the people to be able to do this date, and obviously we fix it around grant shaps. I hope you have found it enjoyable. I know I have. I know I've learned a lot, as I have in the previous two. Feel free to email me with any feedback. I'll be doing another one next year, and in the meantime continuing my various campaigns on climate, and in the very short term on the local electricity bill, and trying to get some more behind community energy. Watch this space on that, because I'll be making an announcement on that very soon. Otherwise, let's keep the dialogue going. I look forward to seeing some of you again soon, and thank you all for coming. See you next time. Bye-bye.